Hello, I'm Dr. Mahesh Rajasuriya. This is the re-recorded narration of the lecture I delivered on 24th July 2010 at the All Ceylon Buddhist Congress Lecture Hall, Colombo, which was one of the lectures in the Sri Lanka Anthropology Association monthly lecture series. A closer look at Sinhala and Western cultures, an interactive discussion. But now it is going to be a narrative only. The original discussion was bilingual, hence some of the slides would be in English while others in Sinhala. What is culture? Before I try to answer that question, let us look at this dialogue. Here Alice and Sean are getting to know each other while waiting for a workshop to start. So Alice says, "Hi, I'm Alice." "Hi Alice, I'm Sean. How are you?" "Very well, thank you." "And how about you?" "Very good, thanks." And they have basically got to know each other. In the Sinhala culture, it would be quite different. Here, another two young people, Diniti and Sapumal, are getting to know each other while their workshop is about to start. So they are striking conversation, and then the first question, unlike in the previous example, they ask when they are starting to get to know each other was not what your name is, but where you are from. So when Sapmal asks that question, Diniti says Kalutara. Then Sapmal mentions a relative of his who lives in Kalutara town area, namely on the station road. And then Diniti gives more information, so ultimately they both realize that they both are aware of they are talking about the same person. So then they had not known these people, but she knows where they live, and she says that these people have shops in the town area, and Sapmal says, "Yes, that's it, that's the one that I'm talking about, but we are not that rich." And then she asks, "Where you are from?" "I'm from Anuradha." And last, they ask each other's names. So it's quite different from the previous example. So what? Before I answer that question, I want to tell what I am going to or plan to do with this lecture. That is, I'm going to post my views about the Sinhala culture and the Western culture and try to compare and contrast them. This is not an established theory, or I'm not reading from a textbook. These are my personal views. So we'll get back to that original question. What is culture? Let me quote Martin Wickramasinghe, a great Sri Lankan writer. His book, Sinhala Language and Culture, written in 1975, on page 14, he says, "Culture is the sum of beliefs, customs, habit, and artistic norms which an individual acquires from his society." He talks about cultural implements. This culture is not the product of the single individual's own creative activity, but a changing social inheritance which extends far back in time if his community has a long history. These beliefs, customs, and habits, which are called culture traits and complexes, are created by the use of cultural implements by that community. So I want you to draw your attention to the word cultural implements. Cultural implements and traits. Therefore, culture consists of two things: cultural implements and traits, created by the use of those implements. In the language of the ordinary man, culture is the total material, mental and spiritual life of a community and all the implements they use in creating their ways of life. Now we get to the examples to implement, so you will understand this. Okay, this is an example of cultural implements, the fork. Now in this example, the woman uses the fork to eat her spaghetti. And in the other example, the man uses a fork and a knife. And they both carry the fork in the left hand, and the woman keeps the fork with the spikes curved downwards, and man keeps it the other way. But in Sri Lanka, we eat with either with hand, or else we eat with the fork and the spoon, not the fork and the knife. And here our fork is in the left hand, yes, the spoon is in the right hand, but we eat with the spoon, not the fork. But generally in the West, you don't eat with a spoon. Only children eat with spoons. So fork is a cultural implement, so is a spoon and a knife and even a head shake and even the question, how are you? All these are cultural implements. So head shake. Now in the West there are only two types of head gestures. One is to say yes, nodding, and the other is to say no, that is shaking. But in the Sinhala culture we have three types of head gestures: nodding to say yes, shaking to say no, and another head gesture which says okay, alright, I'm with it, which is neither nodding nor shaking, but it looks as if the person is shaking his head to somebody outside Sinhala culture. And the next cultural implement, how are you? In Sinhala, it's kohomada. So in the Western culture, it's very much a part of getting to know someone package. But in Sinhala culture, it is almost never used in its purest form, unless it's further qualified and then used. Like when Sapmal said he was in Anuradhapura, Diniti might have asked, so how is life in Anuradhapura? But not how are you, generally, in getting to know. And when two friends meet, this is not getting to know, two friends who know each other meet on the street. It's used as an icebreaker almost always in the Western countries, in the Western culture. In the Sinhala culture also it's used frequently, but sometimes it is replaced by the word bharakta. That means you're onto something, you're going somewhere. Then the genuineness behind the question how are you is almost nil in the Western culture. You can almost always predict the answer. It's good, fine, I'm well, very well, something like that. In Sinhala, in the Sinhala culture, it's probably more genuine. And the example I have cited here is that, as I said, you don't ask it in the purest form except when you meet somebody who you know and you're in a hurry. When you qualify it and ask something like, how are you, dear son, you have become skinny. The area where you work is difficult, isn't it? So you expect a genuine answer, and the question is also genuine. It's not. And the answer, the response to the question, how are you? In the West, it's the typical answer: good, very good, fine, very well. In Sinhala also, you have the typical answers, like similar typical answers. In responding also in the Western culture, you are not expected to be genuine generally. Even if you are feeling upset, you are supposed to say, I'm feeling alright, good, how are you, good. In Sinhala also, you are generally not expected to give a genuine answer, but it may happen. But I don't see a great difference in that sense. The acknowledgement. When you ask how are you, you respond, and it's almost always accompanied by a thank you. But in Sinhala culture, it is not generally accompanied by an acknowledgement. Echoing. In the Western culture, you frequently echo the question. And in Sinhala, you generally do not echo the question. So, I'm trying to build a theory on these observations. Before that, I want to introduce a concept now. Now, this is a well-known concept. It's not my manufacturing theory. This is called the self-concept. The best definition that I found was from this Merriam-Webster online dictionary. Self-concept means the mental image one has of oneself. Self-concept and self-esteem are terms often used interchangeably to describe how a person perceives and evaluates him or herself within the context of their experiences and the environment in which they live. This is a documented definition from sociology. I believe when a person perceives him or herself within the context of their experiences and the environment in which they live, we are talking about self-concept. When he or she evaluates him or herself, we are talking about self-esteem. The basis of perception and evaluation. We use thought patterns, which are technically known as cognitive schemata. Or in simple way, we can say the way we think. The way we think helps us to do this perception, that is to build the concept of self, that is to build self-concept, and to evaluate ourselves, that is to build self-esteem. But the way we think, at least not everything about that we are aware of. It's like an iceberg. You can see only the top, but a great part is hidden. So there are many thinking patterns inside our minds or heads or brains which we are not aware of. So self-concept is the mental image one has of oneself. Self-concept in the Western culture, now these are my observations, I believe is very narrow. Usually the components of self-concept is the body, which is the major part of the self-concept in the Western culture, and then his or her possessions and achievements, physical as well as otherwise, like education, and then his or her own traits, like I'm hot-tempered, or I'm perfectionistic, or I'm disorganized, which is probably a smaller part of the self-concept in the Western culture. In the Sinhala culture, it's much broader, and the usual components are, one of the most important components is the concept called the village. Now, this is not what it means to somebody from the Western culture. This means the person's hometown, more or less the birthplace, where the place the person considers to be from. And then the next important thing in the personal concept in the Sinhala culture is the interpersonal links. The immediate family, extended family, and then the extended family, and then the friends that I have, and the friends of the friends that I have, and the relatives of the friends that I have, and my neighbors, and the prominent persons that I know of, and so on and so forth, which are very, very important in the self-concept in Sinhala culture. And also the socio-economic background. I think I remember all of these were included in that conversation, that getting to know conversation between Diniti and Sapima. And then the possessions and achievements, and then the traits, and then the body. I think you can see the difference as I put it. Okay. So there is more about self-concept, comparing and contrasting between the two cultures. And individualism is very, very prominent in the West, but in the Sinhala culture we don't even have a word for that, because it's very, very insignificant. So what are the manifestations of this self-concept? Since the two self-concepts are quite different in the two cultures, the manifestations should be quite different. So in the Sinhala culture, which is on the left hand side, you are as important as your group or your community. But in the West, the person is much more important than the group or the community. So, personal rights, which are called human rights, are very important, and it's a well-developed concept in the West. But in the Sinhala culture, we had to manufacture a word to describe human rights. But instead, we had a word called Manussakama. And I found it quite difficult to find an appropriate English word for that. The best translation is the humaneness, not humanities, humaneness. So it's how you feel about others, and you do things because you feel for others, not because you are worried that you might violate somebody's rights, but because you feel for the other person or persons and you do something for them. So that is called Manussakama in the Sinhala culture. But the rights are less important than Manussakama or the humaneness. And then the relationships, again, in a way, these are manifestations of the self-concept. In the Sinhala culture, there are so many relationships for a given person, and most of them are very deep or close. Sometimes some people in the West, make kind of an innocent joke saying that in Sri Lanka everybody knows everybody, which is almost literally true. But in the West, the number of relationships a person has is probably low in number and less in depth. For an example, all the relatives are known either as aunt or uncle. But in Sri Lanka, there are so many uncles, Bappa, Mama, Lukutata, and so many. Now, getting to know somebody, I have demonstrated that it's quite different in the two cultures. In the Sinhala culture, it takes a long time, and you have to invest a lot of energy in that, because you have to know where the other person is from, and what are his interpersonal or her interpersonal links, socio-cultural background, and so many things. Therefore, they are a bit hesitant to get to know a new person, because it's a hell of a task. But in the West, it takes only a small time, and usually knowing the name is enough for the initial introduction. So it's easy for somebody in the West to know 10 people at one go, to get introduced to 10 new people, but it's quite a task for the person in the Sinhala. The concept of personal space, it is more prominent in the West, but it is less prominent in the Sinhala culture. Now, the effect of the media. In the Sinhala culture, the most powerful media are rumors or word of mouth and your significant others' opinions and tradition. And then comes TV and newspaper and all the other things. And generally, people in the Sinhala culture consider that you need not learn natural things from from mass media, but you should learn them from your friends or your elders, like how to bathe a newborn child. People in the Sinhala culture are somewhat reluctant to read a manual on this, but they would be quite happy to ask their mother how to do that. But in the West, TV and other electronic and other media are very powerful, and they have a big role. They not only give them news and entertainment, they tell them how to live, how to mourn a loss, how to live your sex life. So it's an accepted norm that you learn how to do things in life. General skills in life you learn through media. It's accepted, unlike in the Sinhala culture. The free will is not a very prominent concept in Sri Lanka or in the West, in the Sinhala culture, but it is a very prominent concept in the Western culture. The democracy, one of the peak productions of the Western culture, is more or less based on free will and individual choice. Self-esteem. Now this is not self-esteem, this is not how you perceive yourself, this is how you evaluate yourself. So to evaluate, to measure, you need a reference point. So you use another person to evaluate yourself. So you take a colleague or a workmate or a friend or a peer and consider your physical appearance with that person. Compare your bank balance, the car you have, your spouse's status. You compare with the peer. That is the reference point, and you give a value judgment for yourself, which is self-esteem. Self-esteem is not a prominent concept in Sinhala culture, and we don't have an original word for that, but it's a very prominent concept in the West. In the development in children, developing a good self-esteem, a powerful self-esteem, a sense of self-esteem is considered to be very, very important. Loss of self-esteem or lack of self-esteem or low self-esteem is a sign of great danger in the West. Mental illness, suicide, all are considered to be preceded by low self-esteem. But in the Sinhala culture, which is heavily influenced by Buddhism, self-esteem or measuring oneself is considered something that you should try to get rid of, or a klesa, which is described by Buddha as mana or measuring. Okay, now about some manifestations of the self-esteem. Winners and losers. In the West, to be a loser is very, very negative. So negative. Now people try to find win-win solutions where nobody loses for problems. But in Sri Lanka, we are not familiar with that concept, winners and losers. We don't think, the people in the Sinhala culture do not think in that line generally. Am I a loser? It's not a question generally asked or considered. Now, another manifestation of the Actually, this is a manifestation of the self-concept. Death anxiety or fear of death. The basis to have a death anxiety is that you have a self-concept. Otherwise, there's no death if there's no self. So when the self-concept is prominent, death anxiety is also understandably would be more prominent. Now, in the Sinhala culture, self-concept is not that prominent, and in addition, most of the Sinhala people, even if they are not Buddhists, they believe in some form of life beyond death. So that's sort of a second chance. It's not all over when you die. So these two factors probably reduce the death anxiety in the Sinhala community. So what is the evidence? Now, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is quite closely linked to fear of death. So usually the stressor that trigger the disorder is supposed to have caused great fear in the person. Fear of a threat to one's existence. Now, PTSD is more common in the West and less common in the Sinhala community. That's what the psychiatrists generally report and feel. There are no very good studies to compare them and prove that, but there was a recent study on the Sri Lankan military which showed that the PTSD prevalence, despite horrible experiences in the recent war, the prevalence of PTSD is remarkably low, something like 2%. But in the West, in the military, in the Western militaries, it is shown to be something like 16%, 18%. So there's a huge difference. And the study done on the Sri Lankan military is a very high quality one, because I personally know the researcher. And when we meet in the Sinhala culture, we talk. It's normal to talk about death, but generally people do not talk about death unless people meet to talk about death in the Western culture. And at a funeral house, usually the dead body is kept at home in the Sinhala culture. The best place in the house is where the coffin is kept, and people touch it, and people post for photographs with the coffin, with the corpse, and they discuss now what might have happened to the person who died, where he or she might be. But it doesn't generally happen in that way in the Western culture. Usually it's the funeral parlor where the coffin is kept, and the coffin is generally covered, and of course you don't pose for photographs with the coffin generally, but there may be variations, of course, exceptions of course. So now this is an attempt to present my views about the differences between the Sinhala and the Western culture. So mostly I discussed about the self-concept, and I also touched upon self-esteem. So the manifestations of the self-concepts are the human rights, relationships, how you get to know somebody you don't know, personal space, and the effect of media, free will, and death anxiety. I hope to plan to do another lecture, a few of them, on further topics related to this one. Thank you very much for watching this presentation.